Hello, welcome back to the studio. Today, well, another Bob Ross classic. This time it's Dimensions. This was from series 22 of the Joy of Painting series, and this is number 7. I've used Bob Ross paints and brushes throughout this painting, but of course I've added my own little twist to it. I've made a few changes and there's a few hiccups along the way. I'll point those out to you as we go along. But you know the routine. Sit back, relax, cup of tea, notepad at the ready. You can get those brushes out and see if you can paint your version of Dimensions, a Bob Ross classic. So here's my canvas, 16 by 20 as usual. I like to paint them light grey so you can see the next stage. That's to add some of this. Bob Ross liquid white oil paint. This is a wet on wet oil painting technique. I'll use 2 Bob Ross 1-inch brushes, this nice new one and an older one here, just for the liquid white and for my dark colours. This soft one for blending. I'll also be using these brushes, a filbert, a fan and a liner, and of course a Bob Ross palette knife. I also put some map pins in my canvas. This gives me the horizon line. Above will be a mountain and below, well, we'll have to wait and see. For ease of use, I store my liquid white in these airtight containers. I pop them in the freezer, it keeps them fresh. I'll use my old 1-inch brush and apply a small amount of liquid white to my canvas. Now you can see why I paint them light grey. This needs to be a very thin, even coat. If you're not sure about putting this onto a canvas, well, I made an instructional video all about it, and I'll put the link right here in the corner. Once you have a thin coat applied, don't forget, finish off with some long flat strokes to even out the surface. Here's my palette. I've only got a couple of colours out so far. I'll add some more later. But this first colour is yellow ochre, and this is on my nice 1-inch brush, my soft one. I'm going to go to the top right hand corner here. You'll notice this colour isn't very strong. In the other corner I'll be putting on some black. That'll be a lot stronger, so you have to be a bit careful, because yellow and black make green. I'm keeping my yellow ochre well away from the left hand side of my canvas here, but I'm letting some of it drift across. I want some water in my painting, so I reflect this colour below the pins. Remember, edge to centre. There. And don't worry if it looks a little bit streaky. It actually works quite nicely for this particular painting. Now, time for some black. I'm using my old 1-inch brush. It still has some liquid white on it from the start of the painting. Top tip, if you want to avoid a green sky, the yellow and black must be almost dry when they meet. As I said, this is my first application of colour, top left hand corner. I've loaded my brush a second time. And a third time. Getting a bit bolder now. By going gently, you'll build the colour up without going green. This is application number 6, I think. Now I feel a bit more confident, and I'm going to be taking this colour along until it just touches into the yellow. But notice, no green sky. You can use the same technique for adding blue and yellow to a sky, but blue tends to be a bit more reactive, so be a bit more careful. Here you can see I've pulled in from the left with some black, but oops, I forgot. I wanted a shimmer of light on the water. What can I do? Luckily, I have a fan brush and some titanium white paint. I'm just going to zigzag this across the surface of my painting to make, well, some little light ripples. Let's paint a mountain. For this, I'm going to need a dark underpainting. Black, phthalo blue, some alizarin crimson. Mix them well. I want a deep inky blue colour for this. There we are. Now, I pull my paint very flat and I slide up to gather up a small roll of paint. This is an easy way to see how much paint you've picked up. Now, position this mountain about 1/3 of a canvas over from the left and not too high, about here. That's the top peak, second lowest and third lowest peaks. Now, finger on the back of the palette knife and press. I want this colour to stain the canvas. Now repeat that process for the next peak, and as you see, I keep all of my dark colour towards the top of my mountain. If you watch Bob paint the mountain peaks, you'll notice he keeps everything well above the horizon line. Don't let the paint drag down too low. You'll lose that lovely misty area. Now, I stand back and think that, well, maybe this peak in the centre could be a little bit taller. I allowed some extra room to let it grow a little bit. So I'm going to join this peak onto that peak. By allowing some room, I can make small adjustments to my mountain scene. There. Now scrape off all the excess. I'm going to add another couple of small peaks to give my mountain some depth and distance. Now, back to my brush that I used to put on the liquid white and black. Notice how gently I sweep the excess paint out and aim for those pins. I also drag some of the light colour back up into the base of the mountain. You'll see how I use that in a second. Now, dry clean that brush one more time and finish off the blending. Time for some snow. I'm going to take my palette knife and, of course, press that titanium white paint flat. Most important. So that we can slide our palette knife back up into the paint and see how much we're picking up. Size for fat matchstick is about right. Now, get this. Look how lightly I hold my palette knife. The direction I want to go is from the peak to the pin with the handle. Now, watch this. The angle is important. If it's too flat, you'll drop all the paint at the start of the peak. Notice I hold it lightly. I can really kick that handle away from the canvas. I let the knife turn and the handle ends up facing the pin. Let's try that again. So, handle up, give it a little start, no pressure, and exit towards the pin. I'll do the same on this little peak as well. Let the handle turn. Now, let's make a shadow colour. Small amount of titanium white, a tiny little bit of phthalo blue, not too much. That's a bit too pale. Add a bit more. There. And to this I'm going to add a little bit of my base mixture colour. I want a sort of blue-grey shadow colour. Make sure this isn't too pale, otherwise it all looks the same as the sort of highlight side. And again, gather up a small roll of paint. Top tip here, I have a little trick. When I put the shadow colour on, I go up behind the white and I bump it. As I bump it, I drag some of that colour over the crest of the mountain peak. Bump and slide away. Bob Ross would do this on his mountain peaks, but I don't ever remember him saying to anybody that was a technique that you should copy. But it's one that I have, and it works quite well. Now, let's finish off this little peak here. It's tucked away in the background. Top tip for mountains. When you're adding highlight and shadow, don't kill off all that lovely dark blue-grey colour we started with. If you do, well, we nicknamed it icing a cake. But if you do overdo it, like I did here, always pick up a little bit of the dark base colour and just go back in and touch back in some of the shadows. It's an easy fix and one that'll save you from, well, having to repaint the whole mountain. I've got my old 1-inch brush back and I'll use this to tap out some of the little bits of snow at the base of the mountain. I just want to diffuse the paint there a little bit more. Get rid of any scratches. So at this stage I was very pleased with my mountain. They really stood out. This painting had a lovely 3D effect about it. Something to do with these colour combinations. Bob was a bit of a master at colours, but I did make a small error. Not bad, but something which you should watch out for in your own paintings. And it's to do with making sure you continue off the edge of your canvas. You can see that my mountain really just faded away a bit too much. Now, I originally thought that I'd have a nice big fir tree on the edge there that would cover it up. But I had to change my mind on that because of the scale. A big fir tree wasn't going to fit my painting. and I ended up with that little sort of dead space on the edge. So take care when you're painting your versions of these paintings. Make sure that you think ahead a couple of steps. Good advice. I wish I could take it sometimes. Anyway, on with the painting. I'm going to carry on with that brush. I can go back into the same blue-grey colour that we made for the shadow side of our mountain. I've darkened it slightly. I want this for the foothills. Now remember that little soft misty area that I was painting? It's what gives my painting depth and distance. I use my 1-inch brush to tap in a foothill. Notice I tip my brush at a slight angle. It gives me a slightly more choppy look. I don't want this to look too smooth. I want it to look like maybe, well, some distant fir trees. So yeah, tip that brush at a slight angle. It's a neat touch. Now, let's lift up some of the paint to make some proper little trees in the distance. So corner the brush and give it a little upward flick. Let's have a close-up of that, I think. I'm going to add a second foothill. I'll dab this base out a little bit more. Again, create a lovely misty soft effect. This is a definite plus to painting with oils. It's one that Bob used to teach frequently. So my next layer wants to be a fraction darker. Just tap it in, save a little bit of mist. And for this one, well, I might pull down a little bit of a reflection. Where the paint has run out is where the reflection will start. Go in with the brush, press firmly and pull straight down. Make sort of like a little fringe, but don't go over it too often. Now, edge to centre with the flat of the brush. Again, don't do this too much, it'll just blend in. For my waterline, I take a clean palette knife and just tap it into some titanium white paint. Just a little is all you need. Now, firm pressure here. Really press and let the knife slide. Notice I keep it sort of straight at the canvas. And then just really push firmly. It leaves just a tiny little trace of white paint. But if you overdo it like that, well, that's an easy fix. Just take a clean palette knife and just give it a rub. Now it looks like a little frosty shoreline. There. I want to think about adding the next layer of my painting, so I need to come in just under that first layer and allow room for maybe 2 more layers. So there's the line I'm going to work to. I've taken that mountain mix colour and I'm going to add to it some sap green. I want a very, very dark, inky green colour for my fir trees and land. Mix it well. Now, Bob used a 1-inch brush to do the next step, but it's a bit big for my painting, so I'm going to use a fan brush. It's the brush I used to put that shimmer of light on the water. It's got a little white in it, but that's fine. I load it well with that dark green colour, and that's the line I want to work to. So I'm going to just put a little reference mark. Just touch with the edge of the fan brush. By doing a little planning at this stage, you won't run out of position. Now, get that handle tipped up nice and high and strike down with the corner of the fan brush. I want to create the illusion of lots of distant fir trees and, of course, some reflections. So if you go below that little layout line, it doesn't matter. I changed my colour and strengthened it up a little bit. It was a bit too pale. There, I think that looks a bit better. I'm going to go a little bit further than the centre line. I just want to sort of close the side of this painting in a little bit more. There. Now, back to the 1-inch brush that I use for painting my sky. I use firm pressure, really press on the canvas and pull down a little reflection of the trees. Notice I use steps to come forward in the painting. This enables you to have what looks like some more depth and distance to your work. Now, before the next step, don't forget, give your brush a dry clean. We're going to be brushing across those reflections, and if there's a drop of dark green paint on there, well, it might just ruin things. So edge to centre, just a couple of flicks is all you need. As we work forward in our painting, I want my colours to be darker and to be able to add more detail. So I've loaded my 1-inch brush with some more of the dark green colour and just tap. This creates some texture. At the side, I'll be adding some fir trees. So just tap across and allow this angle to be sloping down. Having land going up at the sides tends to throw the eye a little bit, and if you have it sloping down, it's more inviting. I'll keep this brush to one side for darks, and my nice brush, what I use for the yellow ochre, will be for highlights. So with my nice brush, I go into some cadmium yellow, some yellow ochre, and maybe even a touch of sap green, just to tone things down. There. I pull my paint out to make sort of like a little curtain of colour. It's somewhere I can load my brush by just sliding it forwards and giving it a little push. Remember which way up you're holding the brush. I have my Bob Ross logo showing. If you load it the same way each time, the brush won't clog. The light's coming from the right hand corner, so I just want to gently touch the top of the dark green paint I just applied. Now, add successive layers of colour, but do save a little shadow here and there. Angle down to the water's edge. It's what Bob called the lay of the land. I'll save that little bit right near the water, maybe for some rocks. In that little dark area there is where I'm going to have some more of these little fir trees. Again, I'm bringing them forwards through that line. Allowing features in different planes of your painting to overlap gives a much more sort of harmonious looking painting. I'm sometimes guilty of keeping things a bit too separated, so here I've done my best to make sure one layer overlaps the other properly. Again, I've left room on the side for a fir tree. Now, Van Dyke Brown. Add some dark Van Dyke Brown just at the water's edge between the grass and those reflections. I'm going to be adding some rocks, but I need this dark sticky brown underpainting to help those highlights stick. I want to reflect some of the Van Dyke Brown into my water, and for this I'm going to use a little fan brush. This is a neat trick if you've got sort of no spare brushes and you've got a really delicate little area to reach in and get some colour. I dry clean my fan brush off camera before I brush across. Try and avoid those little happy accidents. Now, let's make a highlight colour. Van Dyke Brown, dark sienna, a little more of that, and then I need a light colour, either titanium white or maybe some ochre. But put the light colour between the two darks, and then you can see how little I blend them together. I want a marble mix. Don't be tempted to pick this up and turn it over twice because, well, you'll just have a caramel brown colour. Now dig in and get a little bit of that light highlight colour. Super light touch for this, folks, and just let the knife touch. Think about the direction of the land going down to the water's edge. You can see I'm literally using my finger and thumb to hold the palette knife so gently I could almost drop it. When it comes to painting rocks, less is definitely more. I also save some little bits of dark here and there. You'll see why later on. I repeat the process of adding masses of land to my painting. Again, downward angles and little reflections. Make sure you pull those down before you add another layer of land, or else you can end up sort of painting yourself into a corner. Now, top tip here. Look, I've lined up these 2 points of land very evenly, so extend one. I try to make sure things don't look too symmetrical in my paintings. I load some more dark green on my fan brush, this time for some fir trees in this gap. So let's do some planning. I touch with the edge of my brush and tap down till I reach the edge of this piece of land. here's a close-up of the fan brush at work. I'm going to be doing what's called smiley fir trees or uppy trees, pressing upwards with the corner of the fan brush creates a little smile. Don't let the brush skid. We're leaving an imprint of the bristles that looks like pine needles. I carry on working down my fir tree until I reach the ground. As Bob would say, every tree has a little friend, and this is my one. Now, there is this edge along the back here that looks a little bit sharp for my eye. I'm going to go in with my fan brush and some more dark colour here just to soften that line up a little bit. I might add a little bit more highlight back there later on. Don't be afraid to go back and do small corrections on your painting, even if it's a little out of sequence. Do it whilst you remember, because you might just forget. Now, more colour. I change and vary my colours. I use ochre and Indian yellow, and I just want lots of little variations and lots of little bits of shadow here and there in the grass. Now, let's put some highlight on these fir trees. I've gone into some cadmium yellow with a little bit of sap green, and notice how I push my fan brush into that highlight. The light is coming from the right, so the right side of my tree will get the most highlights. By giving my brush a little push into that highlight colour, it means when I touch the tree, mainly the paint touches very little of the bristles. It means that my colours stick easily. I stand back often when I'm painting, and I see that this tree is a little too large for its position in the painting. I bring it forwards by making it lower and bringing it closer to the foreground. A few little touches of highlight, and there. Its scale now fits well with the rest of the scene. Let's add some more rocks. You've seen it all before, so I'll use a little bit of time lapse for this. I know from experience and reading all your lovely comments that not everyone gets on with a palette knife, so let's try highlighting some rocks with a filbert brush instead. You might find this is the way to go for your painting. So again, load a generous amount of colour onto the filbert brush. Again, same gentle touch, and just drag it across the surface of the painting. It still works like a palette knife, but with a sort of slightly softer edge to it. My preference is to use a palette knife. It's how I was taught, but a filbert brush can work just as well. Time for some more planning. I want to bring some land in from the right hand side, but it must fit nicely into the painting, so I make a few little marks first and stand back. I think that looks right. Notice again, I use my dark brush to add in some good textured paint here. And let's not forget some reflections. I want to add a bigger fir tree to this right hand side. Once again, I start off by marking the centre line. I've gone above the edge of my mountain. It helps to push the mountain into the distance. Again, I use the corner of my fan brush with some little upward pushes. Don't let the brush slide. I just want to get the centre line done. Now let's go back down the centre line and fatten things up a little bit. You'll notice I actually do this particular tree in 3 or 4 stages. It doesn't have to be done all in one go. I stand back between each stage. I can see my tree needs, well, a little bit more finessing. Take your time when you're painting fir trees. Bob did them in one go. He had a bit of a time limit, but you don't. Take your time and work at making the best fir trees you can every time. I'll give this one a little friend as well. Drop in the centre, fatten it up, stand back and examine it, and then a little finessing. One more touch up. There, I think that's pretty much done. Ooh, maybe that bit there, or that bit there. I'm going to drop in the suggestion of a trunk. I'm just using some of the marble mix that I used on my rocks. I have some over, so I'll drop it in. Even these ones get a little touch of detail. just as before, push into your highlight colour, get a little roll of it on the edge of the brush and just touch the top edges of your branches. The paint will stick easily. If you have trouble making the paint stick, it might be just a bit too thick. So add the tiniest drop of thinness to your mixture. Now for some bushes, I take my 1-inch brush one direction through my dark green colour, rounded edge first. That means this side of the brush, which has got a rounded side to it. Now press firmly onto your canvas and let the bristles just splay apart. I try and do this so you can see what I'm doing. It's not easy when you're trying to hold the brush and film all at the same time. I'll try and get a better angle in a second. But all I'm doing is just texturing the canvas. Now for some highlights. Back through some thinned highlight colour. Remember, thin paint sticks to a thick paint. Again, I went one direction through the paint, my brush nice open and lacy, and the rounded side first to the top. Here's a close-up. Don't let the brush slide. If you do, it'll make a big smear. I reload with some fresh colour, and again, just touch gently. As you see, it leaves hundreds of little tiny dots of paint. As my brush runs out of colour, I'll drop some down in the water for reflections. We'll have to be very gentle with brushing those out because they'll smear very easily. I give my brush a nice dry clean. Remember, this is my nice brush, my highlighting brush. Soft bristles, super light touch. I've added some more rocks. Don't forget, follow the lay of the land down to the water's edge. No Bob Ross classic painting would be worth its salt without a few scratchy sticks and twigs, of course. And don't forget, waterlines. Earlier on in the painting, I mentioned leaving some dark between the highlights on the rocks, and it's for this. Just tap in a little bit of vegetation to soften the edges of those rocks. It's a small detail, but it really helps settle the rocks into your painting. There, finished. So there you have it, a Bob Ross classic. And if you enjoyed painting this, then you really must watch this next one. It's a painting anyone could paint. Happy painting, people!